Well, we'll start right off now. I will say this, that Deb and I are such history goobers and that we could talk about this all night. We have 5 years of research and a full book that we could talk about. So I've timed us, so when you hear the timer, you know that we're done.
We just know, well, actually, it's telling us we need to get done.
We need to get done.
Yeah.
So what we want to do is we want to start by showing you this contemporary art piece in the Park Avenue Armory, which is Ann Hamilton's. And you'll understand why we've labeled this talk, Finding the Poetic in Edith's House, and the relationship of the book that was just introduced to a case study at the very end of this. The first thing that we started with in understanding house museums is I have a pretty long history running both Philadelphia house museums as well as the house museums in New York City. And there's really kind of 4 types of historic sites in this genre. The top one is when a house has kind of been fallen into disrepair, someone comes along and they decide that it's important and they fix it up. The second one is when you're really lucky. It never really falls into disrepair, and you have all the stuff inside, right? And we'll find out that maybe that's not so great for some things. And then the third part is where the house doesn't get torn down, but it gets moved. And in this case, the Pope Lady house gets moved twice. The Pope Cottage got moved 3 times before Toshiko did the visitor center for it. And then the final is where the house or the building doesn't survive and the entire interior kind of archaeologically gets pulled out and moved to a museum. Now, I'm showing you modernist buildings here as examples, but what's important is not only the names and when they were built, but what's more important for our discussion is when those buildings became house museums. Because we'll talk a bit about that kind of dichotomy between a period of interpretation versus how long these buildings actually have been historic house museums. So we'll ask for you to watch both of these videos, please.
And we ask you to think about the ideal versus the real.
So this is a Jacques Tati film. And this woman in her plastic muumuu is constantly cleaning because she lives in a modernist house, in a modernist landscape, and the only way that they can live in this place is if she's constantly dusting it. And they're off for the day. And this one is a Jack Kerouac Beat Generation film, both 1958.
Early morning in the universe. The life is getting up, open up the windows. This loft that's in the Bowery in the Lower East Side, New York. She's a painter and her husband's a railroad brakeman. And he's coming home in a couple of hours, about 5 hours from the local. Of course, the room's in a mess. There's her husband's coat on the chair. He's been there for 3 days. Neckties and his tortured socks.
Now, so what we're doing is we're showing you, Deb and I are showing you the 2 kind of polarities of habitation. One is one that we're very used to as house museum people because we're constantly keeping our houses clean, we're keeping the interpretations clean, so everything is very curated on all levels. And then we go home to our dirty underwear and our tortured socks and the way that we really live. And one thing that Deb and I have always thought, and we found this painting to be one that we always went back to, all of us in this museum profession are essentially trying to figure out this relationship between cows, looking at a painting of cows that is supposed to reflect us cows. So this kind of strangely meta relationship of what we do. We throw out words like authenticity, accuracy, the historic narrative, when in fact, the truth is, if we all sat and thought about it, that it is a very kind of high-level meta relationship that we're trying to convey. And that's an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. And it's not a simple matter of a period of interpretation and just a binder of descriptions of what kind of furniture is in there.
Yeah, because I think what's really important here is, are we talking about a museum or are we talking about a place where people lived? And we all struggle with that in terms of making sense of this. And so, you know, we can have the cleanliness of the modernist house, or we can talk about what we call the detritus of habitation, which is all the stuff that makes a place feel like a home. And without that, it's very difficult for people to relate to it as a home.
And you understand that, again, we're trying to cover a lot that's in the book, but most of our research very quickly landed on 5 critiques of historic sites and historic house museums. And these 5 critiques, although you may not have all 5 of them, are generally ones that we heard from funders, from visitors, private foundations, people who work there, those of us who just visit.
So I'm going to, yeah, you know, I have to interrupt him. Excuse me for that.
That's why we're timing each other.
That's right. So we're going to go through these 5 critiques really quickly. But as I came to historic house museums, I came from the vein of being an urban designer. And what surprised me most was that these houses were sitting in isolation. We heard about the Poe Cottage in terms of looking at the community. But what really matters is that these houses must become part of the community or they become obsolete and isolated. That's really not something that we're about in this decade, in this century. And so the idea is that we should turn the houses inside out. So rather than focusing what's on the house, in the house, then we have to turn it outside out and look at the community. So this is our first critique.
And the critiques really start to convey what the issues are with historic sites. The first one really is that most historic sites and house museums don't really talk about communities. They don't really engage anything other than their own collections.
Or acknowledge that the community around them has changed, which is highly likely that it has.
The next one is, and we've heard this so many times, we just gave you $100,000 5 years ago. Why are you coming back for another 50? So this critique of the cost per visitor, how many of you have heard that? That these places are so expensive to maintain. And then also as a part of that, we rarely tell our visitors or the public about the extensive amount of kind of sweat and turmoil we go through to preserve these buildings.
And
many times the buildings will be shut off or closed off while you're preserving them, and so people don't have the kind of ability to appreciate the process.
And what's really unfortunate is that process is one that people enjoy seeing in this do-it-yourself culture. People are very interested in the preservation process and what you're doing in order to keep it looking the way that it is. And yet, in most places, we sort of wall that off and we don't share it as if preservation is some sort of secret.
And the next one is one that we found a lot, and that was just communication. And Jeffrey talked a bit about social media. And I joked that for a lot of historic sites, their idea of communication is a kind of handwritten sign on paper taped to the front door that they're going out for lunch or something. Or the flip side, which is a very expensive gilded sign that takes 10 years to put up. There's no kind of middle ground, and there's very little kind of current conversation with very here and now issues.
Yeah, for instance, you know, what are the issues today that were important at the time when the folks who you talk about actually lived in that house? One of the easy ones is immigration. Today in our presidential campaign, immigration is a central issue when they're actually talking about issues. Historically, that was an issue as well. And so to be able to bring those issues of yesterday and today together and make the house relevant is really oftentimes about the stories that are shared.
It's the front page of the paper, we often say. And the next critique is one with the 2 videos actually shows you, and that is that most people consider these places to be overly curated. They don't really believe that this is the way people lived, and that if they lived there, they would feel and look considerably different.
In fact, we know this is not the way people lived, and we have lots and lots of examples in the book about how a house is presented one way and how people actually lived there. We're going to talk about the Farnsworth House in a second, well, a few minutes, and then we'll talk more extensively about this critique.
And the next critique is that they're just boring. Now, even for people who love these places, we've all experienced these historic sites. And Deb and I, we will travel all over the place going to these historic sites, and we can get something out of them. But many times the very experiences are not compelling, and the information they're giving us is not really fleshed out. And it's a guided tour, and all of the stuff that we know. But this critique is a very strong one, that just the very experience is boring. And then we always hear back from museum professionals, well, why don't people come back?
Yeah, and so part of what our research really involved was trying to break that down. What is it that's boring? Why do people find it boring? If we're not speaking to the choir, if we're trying to expand our audience to other folks, then what is it that's boring? And so we set about trying to figure out why that response was happening. We were getting that response so much from people who were visiting houses.
And so one thing we realized right away is that no one had really been doing research on small historic sites, and particularly historic house museums. And so we started to do, and that's what the book is, our own kind of quasi-scientific research, because no one else was doing it. These are two houses in Philadelphia where we tracked carriage riders and people walking on the sidewalk in front of the Powell and Physic House. Close to 600,000 people walked in front of these houses, and look at the percentages that actually entered the houses. Very, very low. Now, some of your houses may not have this problem. You may have the exact opposite problem. We'll talk about that. It's a kind of comprehensive understanding. But in actual fact, in the United States, this is more common than having too many people come into a house.
And so why are they not coming in? What are those barriers that are keeping people from coming in? And there are a lot of very subtle things that are doing that we noticed that houses are doing that are actually keeping people from coming in the front door.
So part of our research over the 5 years was to produce with researchers 1-minute videos that talked about habitation, personal collections, how we live, experiences in house museums, a whole myriad of different ideas. And so what I'm showing you now is a collection of these research tools, which are better outlined in the book.
One of the things that we talk about in the book is the need for a university partnership. And I happen to be that partnership with my graduate students. And my graduate students are all architecture students and not necessarily that interested in historic house museums. They are such a great guide as John Q. Public or Jane Q. Public in terms of what they see. And what we began asking them to do in the very beginning of our research was to tell us about their experience in a house, and then to make a 1-minute video of it. And that might have to do with their own collections and the collections of the house. It might have to do with the neighborhood. It might have to do with them putting themselves doing the same things that the people in the historic house might have done. And to produce this in such a way that we began to get a sense, a visceral sense of what was actually going on in the house or what wasn't going on in the house, and the house experience.
One thing that you'll see is that our research tools are very tactile, they're very immediate, and for instance, the top is community, the middle is how I live, the one on the far right is a house museum experience. The next one is collections. We're particularly interested in not just the collections as artifacts, but how we used them, because we seemed that it was a barrier in house museums that the collections were always object-based, not about the way you actually use them. And then the bottom videos just talk about things that people were really doing instead of going to house museums.
If we had more time, we'd play each of them, and then you could see what they were. But what's most important about this in terms of these videos is what came out of it, these and other tools that we'll share with you. And it was really these 5 categories that we break the house into. And Frank went by the slide, so I can't remember what the 5 are, even. But you'll see. And the 5 ideas in the book are they were extruded from the 5 critiques. And so then we offer some observations and perhaps some solutions that are usable.
And what you're looking at here are several different types of tools that we use during our research. The top one is asking someone to graph their energy, imagination, and excitement in their house tour, also noting what they were looking at. And then at the top of that graph, we asked them in a kind of poetic way what you were really thinking about.
So this is particularly subjective, right? Because, you know, it's a relative line, but what's important are where the peaks and the valleys are. And so that was fascinating. But
because if you look, the peaks are things that we don't spend much time on. They're unrenovated spaces, they're non-curated pieces, they're non-interpreted, they're graffiti on the walls. The things that we spend our most amount of time on highly curated spaces, artifacts, narratives, those are the things that we're getting the lowest marks.
But what's also fun is you can't read them here, but in the book you can see some of the examples of what they were actually thinking about when they were on the tour. And one of the things they were thinking about was, oh, I'm so sleepy. Oh, I'm hungry.
Or I like that yellow, I want to put it in my bathroom.
Yeah.
So those sorts of, I mean, for us to think that everyone is in their greatest educational mind coming to a house
listening to
museum,
the docent, yeah, they're not.
And so we also devised tools like distinct activity surveys where we ask people, just like this audience, to document 2 hours in the morning how many distinct activities that you did, and that came up with a number. So there's lots of interesting ways that we're suggesting to reinterpret a house museum in a way that might be more tactile and in a way that will engage people in a more compelling way.
Now, we didn't talk about the anarchist tags. I think we should.
Sure.
So over here, what you see on the side is an example of the anarchist tags, and I just wanted to pull that out because it's one of the ways that we have learned an awful lot about what people are thinking in the houses other than just the prose at the end. And so all these are little tags that we give to visitors, and we ask them to just fill them out. They're small, so they can't say too much, and to drop them where they're feeling that or where they're thinking that in the house. And so what that gives us is a particular commentary in situ, so that, you know, it's not like the end of the tour, so did you like the house?
An exit survey, or the little stickies that are still curated because we allow them in the frame that they can put at the end. They're anywhere that you want to put them, and you start to notice that they're collecting in certain areas that are kind of surprising. You're like, well, why are they all here at the top of the stair? And then you start to realize that people are standing at the top of the landing looking out at this vista, and this should be incorporated into your view. And so those are the sorts of locational bits that you wouldn't normally get.
Or they might say, what's behind this door? I want to go in this door. I mean, there's an awful lot relative to denied spaces. Everybody wants to go where they're not supposed to go.
And so the book ultimately gets to what looks like a fairly complicated graph, but it's not. It takes all of the 5 critiques, which turn into 5 categories, and there are markings with each one, which are kind of suggestions through our research of ways that someone might be able to reconsider that experience or the way it's been narrated, or the kind of preservation, or their relationship to the community, or how they communicate publicly.
So basically what we're saying here is that it's wonderful to do perhaps a new kind of tour, or to put down the ropes and let people wander through the house, but without an aggressive communication strategy, perhaps through social media, then that won't do you any good. And so what you really have to do is you have to do everything all at once. And so what this chart does is allows you to measure your own house.
Yeah, it's a self-assessment.
Yes.
So you don't need to hire anyone?
No, you don't need to hire an expensive consultant. And you just do this evaluation yourself. This is not meant to be competitive, like, oh, my house got a 4.3, what did your house get? The idea is to complete this chart and then realize where there might be areas that still need some attention.
And if you look at this chart down here at the bottom, you'll notice that eventually it becomes color-coded, and so you could be really good, which is green, in some stuff. And you could be really bad in other stuff, and it's red. And so what that does is it kind of forces us to be honest, right? So you can be really wonderful at one thing and go, ooh, we don't even have a lot of black stuff. So the more black you have out, the more we joke anarchist you are. If you don't have a lot of black stuff in there, then you're probably not really hitting on all cylinders. And so it's one thing that house museums tend to have a problem with. we tend to think, oh, we get great exit surveys for our tour guides. They're really wonderful. But you don't really have very good programs, or you have really good programs and your tour is very stale. This thing kind of forces you into thinking about things holistically.
Yeah, and I think just to sort of wind back to when we talked about distinct activities, you know, if all that your house experience involves is standing and walking, that's only one distinct activity. So what else can we do to expand that?
And this is just one tiny example of that whole chart. It's one marking, and that is integrating contemporary art happenings into your narrative, into your preservation. I'm showing you a whole series of different contemporary art happenings that have occurred in various houses that I've managed, that we've consulted on. And so you'll see they range everywhere from very delicate kind of two-dimensional art to fully immersive theater experiences, site-specific dance, avant-garde film. These things, if you look at the bottom statistics, you know, these are not just cool events. They actually bring in more money at the gift shop and more visitors into the house. And just like Jeffrey was talking about, and I would say your 24-hour event is in fact a happening that this would fit into. And so your constituency is an entirely new kind of type of person.
And that's really an important point, because the people who generally come to historic house museums tend to be aficionados, right? I mean, they know about your house, or they're lovers of history, but what about that other 99%? What about those folks that are a rich audience? How do you bring them to the house? And so this is one way of doing that, but there are a multiple of other ways of getting folks who may not know they'd be interested in your house, but once you get them there, they could easily become interested in it.
And so now we'd like to talk about kind of the case study that we're working on right now, which is a studio at UNCC that Deb and I are teaching, and we've named it Edith's Home, and it's about the Farnsworth House and building a visitor center at the Farnsworth House.
And so probably most of you know that the Farnsworth House is not about Edith Farnsworth, it's about Mies van der Rohe. And
so all you have to do is look up on Twitter, and it's Mies's Glass House. It's not Edith's Glass House.
And so it's interesting, before this competition came out to do, we had already been doing some research on Edith's house, and we're really surprised by her erasure. And it speaks to the fact that so many historic house museums are about the old dead white guy, right? And so there's this incredible community that had to be there to support him. And so this is, you know, the feminist side of me comes out screaming to say, where's Edith? Why do we not have any remembrance of her in the house? And why do we choose Mies to celebrate when that's the last thing Edith would have wanted to do?
And in fact, as someone who has been involved with historic houses for over 20 years, someone as part of a marginal community, marginalized community, I ask the same very questions, because how many times have you kind of heard behind the scenes, well, this gentleman was gay? We don't really talk about that for various reasons. So whether it's a female, whether it's gender biased, or another kind of marginalized effort, remember, only 3% of all historic sites in the United States directly tie to any of these kind of marginalized communities. And this is one of the kind of reasons why this studio starts to look at Edith, and we just started to do an analysis of Mies's furniture plan versus Edith's, how she actually lived there, with over 60% more things, and that doesn't include all of her books and everything.
So Edith's home and the way she lived there with all her detritus, and then of course the way the house looks today as an architectural icon. And so we ask, is this appropriate? And so if you're designing a visitor center, do you continue with this direction?
What's it for? Who's it for?
Why?
And you can see how fundamentally, as an anarchist, you're kind of reviewing a narrative, the very fundamental narrative that the house is presenting. And so we've asked the students to build a model of the Farnsworth house, but not just the way Mies wanted it. We actually have them build the screens that Edith had to put on there because she said the mosquitoes were eating her alive. we're not building Misa's furniture, we're actually building Edith's furniture.
So Edith wanted to be out in nature. I mean, you can see her picking flowers with her dog here. And so when she went to Mies and said, I want a weekend house where I can sort of be one with nature, those weren't her words, those are mine. And what he did was build her a hermetically sealed glass box.
Now, we're not arguing and discussing the modernist perspective as an architect.
No.
We're viewing this as a place of habitation, which is from the anarchist perspective. And then we've also, this is Mies actually pulling a curtain at the Farnsworth house. What we've started to do is look at elements in the Farnsworth house that were distinctly Edith, like for instance, the closet. She kept asking for a closet, and I think Mies said, just hang your dress on the back door of the bathroom.
That's what he said, yeah.
And so she kept insisting, and finally he had an apprentice build this closet for her. But what's interesting is the closet, for various reasons, is no longer in the house. It's in a storage building outside of it.
Because because it flooded, which this site does quite a bit. It floods because Mies sort of did the calculation wrong for, where a floodplain was. But nonetheless, this closet is now in a round sort of shack where it was put until they solved the flooding problem.
And so we also looked at one of the things are the curtains. We've always seen this kind of imagery of these diaphanous curtains and how beautiful they are, but they're always photographs during the day from the outside. What we did is we started to investigate what lighting the inside of the house would look like if you lived there and the impression that people would get on the outside. And this just supports the kind of feeling that, for instance, Edith had a difficulty in actually living in the house.
Yeah, so what we discovered in terms of the experiments is that while Edith said that she felt like a caged animal wandering around the house and that people could see her at all times, and so we looked at what that meant with the curtains at night, and we realized that Edith was still prowling around at night and could still be seen even through the curtains because they were made of raw silk and had some translucency to them.
And we assume that everyone here knows the kind of relationship between Mies and Edith. And finally, she does leave and the house falls into disrepair. It's one of those houses like the Villa Savoy that kind of falls apart and then someone comes along and fixes it up. And here's a picture of how Edith lived in it with her screened-in porch and her pull-down blinds because the drapes didn't work for her and she didn't want to be bitten by mosquitoes. And then also we know that I think it's been flooded 8 times.
Yeah.
I mean, it flooded almost immediately after the house was built.
And so you see here that the house was not a glass house. The house was sort of solid, when you add the screens and you add the blinds. And so it was a completely different reality in terms of its habitation than it was when Mies saw it. And remember, is that when Mies did this work, he also brought in furniture, his furniture to go in the house, and Edith said, no, I don't want that furniture in this house.
And so why are we bringing this up? It's a case study of a way that there is an entirely kind of separate way of viewing historic house museums that still acknowledge, for instance, the architect, but view it from a point of habitation, from the people who actually live there. And we're showing you our studio class with the model right now as we're right in the middle of this investigation. And so ultimately this leads us back to the book, which is about transformation. And that is that if your house museum site is interested in some form of transformation, it doesn't mean you have to be totally one way or the other. What Deb and I would like to do is present to you the possibility that you can be trying things and failing, and then keep trying until things start to kind of congeal and become interesting in ways that we would have never thought about before.
Yeah, and as we work on Edith's house here, what we are trying to do is work on it in such a way that it recalls the things that Edith valued. And so she loved her flowers, she loved her dogs, she clearly loved her clothes and that closet. She loved being outside and feeling the wind and smelling the flowers and listening to the
So when we
the
talk
river
about
run by.
spirit of place, right? This is what we're talking about, and this is where we're coming from. It's not just about preservation. It's not just about collections management. That's why the title is Anarchist Guide. We take those things, we deconstruct them, and we flip them, we invert them. We say that people are the most important, visitors are the most important.
Community is the most important.
And so that's where we are with this sense of transformation, and we just gave you 5 years of research in a little bit more than 20 minutes, but thank you so much.
And we'd love to have your questions. We always do. Thank you.